Tonight, billions spent training Afghans to fight their own war. An American general argues it is finally paying off.
Well, I can tell you, having been on the ground now almost 2 years, we've made really significant progress in this effort.
But in the heat of battle, will the Afghans fight against their own countrymen? A special investigation of what happened to some American soldiers who relied on their Afghan comrades.
He said that the ANA were going home at night, and I think things are not right. Something's not right. I could tell the fear in his voice.
And after nearly a decade of war, a drive across Kabul is still no easy task.
We got our route, we got comms. In case of any small arms fire, we push on.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports. Good evening from Kabul, Afghanistan. No matter how much you've heard about this country, about the blood spilled on desert sands and in foreboding mountains, there is finally the beginning of some real hope. Cautious hope, mind you, but hope that the tide in this war could be turning. And not just in the military major fighting areas, but on training grounds such as this. This is the National Police Academy in Kabul, and on these training grounds, Afghan men and even some camera-shy women are part of a new force that aims to be professional, competent, and respected rather than feared. At least that's the goal. In recruiting centers across the country, people are signing up for the National Police and the Army at record rates, an average of 9,000 Afghans every month. Everyone from young men from the provinces to wizened warriors who once fought the Soviets and are now studying to become senior officers. And most surprising, Afghan women being welcomed into the Air Force, some as future helicopter pilots.
Your attitude indicator at the top has a little arrow.
On a week-long reporting trip in late July, we saw training in full swing.
5 rounds, fire!
And sensed palpable optimism among the leaders we met, that Afghanistan will be able to stand up when the United States stands down in December 2014. It's a far cry from just 2 years ago, when top U.S. brass sounded the alarm that the war was in danger of being lost entirely. So why this major change? Tonight, we begin to look at a new strategy, a new commander, new hope, and a lot of money.
I know it's your job, but you're doing it very well. That's the key thing.
It's a hot Saturday morning, and American Lieutenant General William Caldwell has arrived at the Afghan National Army Recruiting Command to personally inspect the newest enlistees. Caldwell is the 3-star general overseeing the joint U.S.-NATO effort to build a new Afghan army and police force. He arrived less than 2 years ago, but for Caldwell, time is short. The withdrawal of some U.S. forces is already underway, with all combat troops scheduled to be out in little over 3 years' time. Well, you've gone on the record and you said it unequivocally. Can it be done by 2014? And you said yes.
December 2014.
December.
Yes.
Got you.
I need that extra 12 months.
I understand. The clock is ticking. It's General Caldwell's job to make sure the Afghans are ready. Some 300 men have just arrived at the National Recruiting Command outside Kabul to be vetted and vaccinated.
Had you ever had a shot before?
Many for the first time. 15% will be disqualified for medical reasons, and new biometric scans have rooted out criminals and other undesirables. Since March, they've discovered 900 Afghans who were trying to enlist twice to double their pay.
Is it easy to...
Caldwell is hands-on, and he can afford to be picky because the number of Afghans signing up for Army life has surged six-fold since he took over in November 2009.
Every month we're now able to turn away about 1,000 young men for a multitude of reasons, because there's that many recruits, there's that many young Afghan men that are willing to come in and serve in the police and Army.
Those who make it will be paid $165 base pay every month, directly deposited into bank accounts they can access on their bases. These men qualified and are off to 8 weeks of basic training.
I really see you, the younger generation, as the future for Afghanistan. Thanks. So thank you for what you're doing.
How are we really doing with this effort to build Afghan security forces, both military and police?
Well, I can tell you, having been on the ground now almost 2 years, we've made really significant progress in this effort. We now have committed the resources, we've got the right strategy, we're bringing in the right types of people that are necessary, and so in the last 24 months there's truly been a tremendous uplift in building up their ability to take the lead for greater security and starting to professionalize a force that before was largely untrained, ill-equipped, underpaid, and poorly led.
When you first came, you took command, what, 20 months ago? Things were a bit of a mess, were they?
Yeah, truly what we found, especially in the police force, you know, half the police force had never been formally trained. They had very poor equipment. They had absolutely no up-armored kind of vehicles of any kind, not one. I mean, it was truly a force that was cobbled together and had not even been able to start being professionalized.
Why was that true? We had at that time been in Afghanistan for quite a while. How could that have been?
Well, what you found, there was no one organization in charge of police training. Everywhere around the country had different pockets of, perhaps little places of excellence of police training, but no overall coherent national effort.
So what's happened to the $13 billion U.S. taxpayers spent on training before Caldwell arrived? He said his predecessors had outsourced much of the training to contractors, who, according to Caldwell, were overpaid and underworked, a fact he discovered when he visited the National Police headquarters a month into his assignment.
The contractors were showing me around who were doing the training for us. And I remember asking them as I was watching this weapons range, the rifle range, I said, are they qualifying on their weapons? And he goes, well, no, sir, we don't qualify them on the weapon. I said, well, should not a policeman who's a national kind of deployable police force be able to accurately shoot their weapon? He goes, yes, sir, but that's not what we do. Well, it's not in our contract. So then I was talking to him about the training day, and they were finishing every day at 3 o'clock. I said, well, shouldn't we be taking advantage of the rest of the day? He goes, yes, sir, but it's not in the contract.
Things weren't much better in the Army. The U.S. was building up a sizable Afghan force that may have looked impressive on paper, but was full of men who couldn't recite the serial number on their weapon, much less read a map or direct artillery.
The late Ambassador Holbrooke, Richard Holbrooke, had a talk with me in November 2009 here outside of Afghanistan and said, now, General, you know, you're going to have to teach literacy because they're all illiterate. In fact, only 1 out of every 10 recruits coming in can even read and write. Only 1 out of every 10 new recruits has the ability to even know what a number is or a letter is. And that's how literate they are. And I remember looking at him and saying, Ambassador, all due respect, I don't do literacy, I'm a military soldier.
General Caldwell was soon eating his words. He quickly realized that more trucks and guns wouldn't solve the problem. What the Afghans needed was leadership training, a buildup of human capital, and that would take more troops.
I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan.
What changed everything, Caldwell says, was President Obama's announcement in December 2009.
These are the resources that we need to seize the initiative while building the Afghan capacity that can allow for a responsible transition of our forces out of Afghanistan.
The focus and effort on training in the fall of '09 had not been put there. It truly, when President Obama made the decision to do the surge, also came with that the decision that we were going to do training right, and he was going to put the resources against it.
30,000 more U.S. troops meant that the Defense Secretary at the time, Robert Gates, could spare a battalion devoted just to training.
I call it the game changer in January of 2009 when he gave me my 1st Infantry Battalion and said, here's 800 military professionals. Go use them as you see fit to get at the training of the police and the Army.
1 battalion became 2, and today more than 3,100 trainers are teaching everything from how to operate a front-end loader to how to fly a helicopter. As for those contractors, he's cut their numbers in half. Caldwell's budget also surged to $11.6 billion this year for training and maintaining Afghan forces. The Afghan Army and police have grown by 114,000 people in the last 2 years. And Caldwell also got something his predecessors never had: authority over all NATO trainers. There are now representatives from 35 countries training soldiers and police in Afghanistan. There are Mongolians teaching mechanics, Germans teaching police training, and Jordanian women teaching Afghan women how to shoot. For the first time, basic literacy, that is, being able to read and write at a first-grade level, is a requirement for Army and police recruits. They even have what they call a literacy village. It's a school on an Afghan Army base in Kabul, teaching the basics to young men who have never been educated in anything other than conflict. It takes 64 hours of lessons to get the recruits to be able to write their name, their province, and their ID card. And while we were there, the 100,000th Afghan passed his literacy test, holding up his pen like a trophy.
There's people that have talked about the greatest generation in America. I'm not sure what this will do for Afghanistan, but I know without us having been here and done this literacy, there would have been absolutely no hope for them in the future. Today, the possibilities, the doors that have been opened for them are far greater because of this literacy effort.
And to those who argue, and there are some who do, that this is a classic case of 2 things. One, mission creep on the part of the military, and 2, the idea that it's nation building, and that's not what military forces realistically can be expected to do or should be expected to do.
Well, what I say back to them is, I want that soldier to read his serial number and account for that weapon. I don't want to lose that weapon. I want that soldier to know if he or she are getting paid what they're supposed to get paid, because I want to eliminate corruption. I mean, these are really very basic skills that we take for granted in our nation that don't exist here, and so we really have to give them those skills if we think this force is going to actually be able to endure.
What about the argument that says corruption is so deep and abiding in the country that somebody's always going to be able to pay off, buy off a policeman who's supposed to be guarding a hotel or a school or what have you, and that you just can't overcome it?
You know, as you look around Afghanistan this past weekend, we had a district police chief down in Helmand province whose 8-year-old son was kidnapped by the Taliban. And they demanded him to turn over his radio, information on the police in his charge, and his weapon. And he refused to do it, and they hung his son. Now that kind of brutality is beyond actually my comprehension. But what was amazing to me was the persistence of that police officer, an Afghan police officer, who was going to do that to take care of the people of Afghanistan. The idea is that you all will be the ones.
It's impossible to spend time with General Caldwell, his staff, and the NATO training mission and not be impressed by their commitment to getting the training right. But there's a big difference between running an excellent recruiting and training program and actual field performance.
Today we're firing 50 cal, pretty much familiarization as far as firing approximately 50 to 60 rounds per soldier.
When we caught up with Army Company 207, practicing heavy artillery exercises at the foot of the Safi Mountains, Afghans were still getting familiarized with their weapons, and these Afghans were just a month away from deployment. But a young army is just one of the concerns. Caldwell's staff concedes that more than 20% of the Afghan army walks away every year, possibly because there's no punishment for desertion. And then there's the cost to maintain the new army and police. Salaries, fuel, and ammunition will cost $6 to $8 billion a year, a sum Afghanistan cannot afford on its own.
Based on your experience, what are the odds, what do you put the odds that the country falls apart after the U.S. and its allies leave, reverts to civil war, ethnic and tribal differences tear it apart? Do you think, as far along as you say we are now, is that still a working possibility, probability?
They've been through 30 years of civil war. They've lived through the Taliban period, and they're trying to come back together as a nation. We literally, when we form units, we make sure that they're ethnically built upon the ethnicity of all the different groups here in this country. So we have a 44% Pashtun and a percentage for Tajik and Hazaris and Uzbeks, and we go right down the line. So each unit we form is representative of the nation of Afghanistan. We're giving them, perhaps for the first time, an understanding and appreciation for the power of what this country can do when they all work together.
While U.S. and other NATO combat troops are scheduled to be out by the end of December 2014, the trainers will remain well past then. And General Caldwell hopes Congress will keep its checkbook open for years to come.
You know, we learned a very tough lesson before in America when we cut off all assistance and involvement here in Afghanistan. I think this time what I would hope we would see from the international community and my own nation also is a willingness to still remain engaged with them and to continue to support them.
General Caldwell's mantra is that Americans and Afghans work shona b'shona, or shoulder by shoulder. But there have been devastating breaches of that trust. In a moment, next up on our program, a special investigation of what happened at one remote outpost when Afghan soldiers and Americans came under fire. As we've been reporting tonight, the American Military Command paints an optimistic future for the alliance between NATO and Afghan troops. But a 6-month investigation by Dan Rather reports of an incident involving one remote outpost calls into question whether Americans can ever really rely on their Afghan counterparts. What happened on this mountaintop in the spring of 2009 left many searching for answers, especially a set of parents back in Colorado.
Jimmy was proud of his country and worked hard for his country and was good at what he did. And then not to have the families know what happened is shameful.
Jim and Patricia Pirtle are the parents of Sergeant James Pirtle. He was stationed with 6 other coalition soldiers and a platoon of Afghan troops at this mountaintop compound called Bari-Alai in eastern Afghanistan's violent Kunar province.
He felt that the armed forces were really doing a great job and that they were there to help get rid of the bad guys and help the people get a better life going. He really believed in that.
Sergeant Pirtle served alongside a platoon of Afghan National Army soldiers, or ANA, shown here in a home movie taken by another soldier. The conditions were stressful and austere. According to Pirtle's parents, the longer he was at the compound, the more suspicious he became of his Afghan counterparts.
Last time I talked to him, he had something in his voice I had never heard before. I can't even describe it.
Sergeant Pirtle told his mother that Afghan troops were sneaking off the base at night.
I, like an idiot, said, well, maybe they want to be with their family, and so I don't know. And he said, "No, Mom, you don't understand. They're not allowed to. They're not allowed to leave, and they're doing it." I could tell the fear in his voice.
That fear turned out to be justified. This is First Light, May 1st, 2009. Observation Post Bar-e-Allah is under attack by an estimated 50 Taliban fighters. This is a side of the Afghan war you rarely see, from the point of view of the enemy. It became a propaganda video created by the Taliban. It gives a tragic glimpse into one of the only times in the 10-year war where a position manned by coalition and Afghan soldiers has been completely overrun by insurgents. Attackers were so bold they carried video cameras right into the perimeter of the outpost as they directed deadly fire towards the entrance of a bunker. At the end of the battle, the brazen attackers stood nearby, even as U.S. Army choppers drew near. Footage from a U.S. military plane flying overhead shows the base engulfed in flames. The battle lasted less than an hour. Sergeant James Pirtle was killed, along with U.S. Army Staff Sergeant William Weil and Specialist Ryan King. Also among the casualties were 2 Latvians and 5 Afghans. The scene was gruesome. One of the first coalition soldiers to reach the base after the attack recorded the devastation on video. With the outpost all but destroyed and the enemy on the run, coalition troops were soon back in control of Bar-e-Allah, but there were serious questions about how NATO commanders could have let something like this happen. And here's where the story takes an ominous turn. Not everyone at Bar-e-Allah died that day. In the video taken from the U.S. plane, you can see the insurgents leaving the scene of the battle with 12 Afghan soldiers who surrendered and were taken prisoner. A large rescue mission was launched to find and free the Afghan Army POWs, seen here in the Taliban video without their uniforms. But before they could be rescued, they were surprisingly released. According to a U.S. lieutenant colonel quoted by Fox News, the released prisoners were in, quote, good condition. Too good, actually. It was, according to reports from the scene, a common sentiment among American soldiers who served in the area. Suddenly, blogs were being filled with comments such as, quote, you cannot trust the Afghanis, and I was there after it happened. The chain of command knew that something was going to happen and did not take the proper steps to help out. Meanwhile, back in Colorado, the Pirtles were desperate for answers, and all they were getting were conflicting stories.
I was in contact with some of the soldiers that served with him. I was in contact with his captain's commander, got a different story. So everybody I talked to in the military, I heard a different story.
Eventually, the Pirtles did receive a report from the military, but it was heavily redacted. However, the investigation did reveal far more was going on at Bar-e-Allah than their son had told them. There were some disturbing clues about a strained relationship between coalition forces and Afghan soldiers. According to U.S. and Latvian soldiers, quote, the ANA soldiers were insubordinate to their superior officers and would regularly abandon their guard post. Also, arguments and fights broke out between Afghan and coalition soldiers. And at one point, according to an American soldier we spoke to who was there until just days before the attack, the friction was so intense that some Afghan soldiers had, quote, cocked their rifles, unquote, after a fight. Patricia Pirtle heard about that incident, too. She says it was around that time that her son's attitude suddenly began to change.
I think that's when he started to sense that things were not right. And he didn't come right out and say it, but you could tell that he really, I think, was starting to question what was going on and who was in control. And
With the tragic death of all the American soldiers on Bari Alai, it's difficult to get a clear picture of what actually happened. But not all of the NATO soldiers at Bari Alai fell on that fateful day. This is Riga, the capital of Latvia. Private Alexandrs Pisarevs is one of 2 Latvian soldiers who survived the attack on Bari Alai, and his suspicions echo those of his fallen American comrades.
Nu, likas, jā, visu jo visu laiku bija apšaudes, visu laiku bija kaut kas. Tāpēc mēs mēģinājām tur vēl uzlikt uztaisīt vēl sienas lielākas, tur visu bunkuru uztaisīt labāku. Visu laiku likas, jo tad viņi, vairs nerunā ar mums tā, kā agrāk tas bija. Tas, varbūt tāpēc seržants Pauls teica man muterī tā, kā viņš arī saka just, kā ir tā.
Private Pisarevs was part of a team to train Afghans in the field.
Mortar test fire.
Pisarev says that during the attack, when he and his fellow Latvian, Sergeant Anševits, went to engage the enemy, his Afghan counterparts refused to join the battle.
Kad mēs izgājām ar seržantu Anševicu no istabas, visi skrēja iekšā. Vienīgais, kas tur bija, tas bija seržants, viens no afgāņu, seržants. Viņš viņus dzēnē atpakaļ uz posteņiem, ar kājām sita pat, lai viņi iet uz posteņiem, bet viņi neklausījās nevienu. Un cik es zinu, tas seržants bija nošauts pēc tam. Visi pārējie laikam dzīvi palika, tas seržants vienīgais bija nošauts. Nezinu, kā viņi apvienojas vai nē, bet šaut viņi pretī toši negribēja. Tie, kuri šāva, tie arī tur palika. Pārējie visi dzīvi.
The report goes on to say, Afghan soldiers disappeared during the attack. Mines protecting the perimeter of the base had been sabotaged, and coalition forces were keeping explosives in their living quarters for fear of theft from Afghan soldiers. Plus, the enemy seemed to have detailed knowledge of the base layout and defenses. Information that the investigation states could have come from locals who were hired to help build the outpost. Pisarevs heard from one local boy that coalition forces were not well liked.
Viņš sāka stāstīt, tas ir tas. Un mums apkārt stāvēja 3 villaģi, Teiksim tā, no 3 tam ciemām, aptuveni, kā viņš pateica, 3 ģimenes ir par jums. Un pārējie ir visi pret. Visi ir par Talibanu. Tā ir attieksme civiliem priekš mums. Visi.
The redacted version of the report the Pertles received lays out a grim picture of incompetence and defiance by Afghan National Army soldiers. But that doesn't tell the whole story. We obtained a copy of the report without redactions. What the Pertles back in Colorado didn't see was this: clues that the disaster at Bari Alai can also be traced directly to regional U.S. commanders. They knew the outpost was a target and that the enemy was intent on taking out the base. And then there was this. According to our investigation, a number of soldiers from privates to majors had for months requested reinforcements at Bari Alai. Requests that went up to the highest levels of command at Forward Operating Base Bostik, the parent base of Bari Alai. Requests that were never granted.
Par to atbalstu mēs jau sen runājam. Mēs visu laiku zvanījām uz Bostiku, mēs visu laiku prasījām, ka mums vajag cilvēkus. Ja būs kaut kas notiks, tad mums visiem šeit būs. Viņi solīja, ka būs, bet tā neviens arī neatnāca. Es domāju, ja būtu amerikāņi, tur būtu labāk. Vismaz vairāk cilvēki un vairāk paņemtu sektorus.
We tried to speak with a number of members of the U.S. military for this report, including a lieutenant colonel who was in command in that area at the time. He agreed to an on-camera interview, but later declined. We were told by his press officer it was due to security concerns and that he stands by the investigation. We asked him via email why more coalition troops were not sent to reinforce Bari Alai. We received no response.
If the intel had gone up the ladder that something was possible in that area, they should have reinforced that area.
And I'd like to know why they didn't feel it was necessary to evacuate them when I think they should have.
The loss of 5 coalition soldiers in such a devastating attack provided a painful lesson. Unlike other outposts, Bari Alai was not abandoned. It was remanned and reinforced.
3-2, sailing ready to copy next 9 line.
Coming up next. Bari Alai 1 year later. It's still home to U.S. troops and still under attack. Over the course of the last few years, the U.S. military has drastically rethought its strategy and tactics in Afghanistan. Remote mountain bases were closed across the country in favor of a larger troop presence in population centers. But through it all, even as other outposts were shut down, Bari Alai remains open. But the way it operates now has changed significantly. Cameraman Bill Thomas traveled to the outpost for the 1-year anniversary of the attacks to see firsthand what lessons have been learned and whether or not a successful joint Afghan and coalition outpost is a realistic goal. It's barely recognizable from its former self. Rebuilt and refortified, it now stands as a hilltop fortress that takes fire as often as the sun rises.
The enemy definitely has tried in the past and tries regularly to attack this position.
First Lieutenant Richard Rowe, the commanding officer in charge of a new group of soldiers defending Bari Alai.
The snipers and the optics up here can keep eyes on as well as CAS.
The pleas for more troops may not have come in time to help the soldiers who were here in May of 2009. But it's clear coalition commanders have learned a painful lesson.
Man through it, come on.
1 year later, a much larger force of U.S. soldiers stands atop this hill. We can't tell you exactly how many, but it is many times more, and every one of them has heard what happened on this mountain before.
Kind of nerve-wrenching knowing that this place got taken over and overran 30 days before I came here.
Not gonna lie, I was scared. I got here, the very next day we got into contact, and the contact didn't stop until 12 days later.
We've taken contact pretty much half the month, all of the month, at least once a day, twice a day for the whole time I've been up here, which I've been up here for going on 11 and a half months.
The constant attack from insurgent forces is one thing that hasn't changed in the year following the overrun.
3 feet in front of them.
But now, with greater numbers and a direct contact to close air support,
Dark Knight 3-2, sailing ready to copy next 9 line.
every threat is met with overwhelming force. In just the 2 weeks we were there, 26,000 pounds of bombs were dropped onto these hills from U.S. aircraft. And 150 mortar rounds were fired at the enemy in defense of Bari Alai.
I would say that I am shooting the most rounds in Afghanistan. I've been one of the most contested observation points of Afghanistan my whole deployment. And I've been here the whole time in this very pit, shooting rounds every day.
But impressive firepower isn't the only change. We spent 2 weeks at Bari Alai, and from our observations and what the soldiers are telling us, the Afghan army may be finally stepping up to the plate.
This unit up here with us now is very aggressive and very well trained to destroy the enemy. We're really working as a team.
Now bolstered by a full NATO fighting force, the Afghan army has finally begun to follow the example. There is a concerted effort to foster teamwork. Where once there was tension and animosity, now lies cooperation and on occasion, even a sense of camaraderie.
You gotta go like this.
Their level of professionalism may still be a far cry from their coalition partners.
Yeah, the A&A just spray and pray, you know, like, they're coming from the north! Like, we're definitely the more precision.
But for now, at least, they seem to be fighting on the same side, ready to put themselves in harm's way. While Bar-Reilly has undergone a massive transformation, the men here still live under quite austere conditions. They receive one hot meal a day and go without showers during their 4-month rotations up on the hill. By day, these soldiers continually defend the base against enemy attacks. And by night, they're hard at work preparing for future ones, engaged in a never-ending task of building up defenses.
It's a love-hate relationship. You pretty much hate the sandbag until it saves your life one day. They're good, but they suck. I'm pretty sure I have nightmares about them when I go back home.
But even with all the sweat put into shoring up the defenses, here in the violent mountains of Afghanistan, war rages. And there's no such thing as a safe place to be.
Right, 80.
Holy shit.
That was something bigger than a regular bullet.
Bullets will always find their way into outposts like this.
You can see the hole right there in the toolbox.
They can just come right into, like, it'll come right over these sandbags and hit down there.
Most of the single shots that we've been getting are rounds like this.
This one's got a huge gash right here, so you can see that it ricocheted off something and then ended up falling.
Needless to say, if it hits you in the chest, you don't have heart, you don't have a lung, you don't have anything left in your chest. It sucks.
Vulnerability to enemy fire is a fact of life at this base, and on one occasion just weeks before we arrived, it proved fatal for one soldier.
We did lose one U.S. soldier. He was hurt pretty bad. His name was Specialist Wickman. He was shot here at Battle Position 1.
He was standing in a BP and got shot in the shoulder, just standing in the BP. Like, that should be an area that you would feel you're protected in, right? That Dunluck bullet.
Specialist Wickman's death was the only casualty in the 12 months since Bar-Reilly was overrun. But it was a grim reminder of just how dangerous and how real this war is. These American troops are, in essence, target practice for the Taliban. And with all the firepower the U.S. military can muster, these soldiers are still at the mercy of a band of guerrillas hiding out behind those rocks.
That might be that little fucking cave.
It's an enemy that you seldom see.
There's people all over these hills. I mean, we're sort of like ghosts. Every day it's a different spot. It's pretty frustrating because we'll scan all day and not see anything until they open fire on us. So.
You see anything on that land bridge?
Tension at the base started to build as the first anniversary of the overrun of Bar-Reilly approached. Would the insurgents mount another ground attack?
I guess they could look at it like God granted them a victory a year ago, and so to this day I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, they throw everything they got at us.
But this time, the soldiers at Bar-Reilly were ready.
It's been very well prepared for. The enemy will have a much more difficult time this year than they did last year.
We got A&A up here, we got our platoon up here. I'm not worried about it. At the same time, like, I think I'm definitely going to see action, but that's, you know, that ain't my first rodeo, you know, like, bring it on.
And sure enough, on May 1st, the enemy brought a wave of fire against Bar-Reilly.
Right there to the left of TRP-10 in that V. Right there, Seals. Change your camo!
Hang on.
Where's it coming from? Sounds like two. 2. 3-2 copies, weapons away. Hold on.
Maybe they're gonna wait and hit us tonight.
I was like, they're late. Alright, there we go.
On this day, the defenders of Bar Ely would prevail.
See the big shadow just going up the mountainside? We just got lucky, like we followed the sounds in the direction and then we happened to see that muzzle flash. Old boy paid for it.
You really have to act quickly and bring as much firepower to bear against the enemy as possible to either destroy the enemy or to get him to run away. And that's what's going to keep you safe up here.
The hard work fortifying this base, the new quick response air support, and the additional forces stationed here seems to have paid off. History did not repeat itself, and Bar Ely stood its ground. In the end, the massive ground attack the soldiers prepared for never came. What came was daily life on Bar Ely. I've been coming to Afghanistan for more than 30 years. The country and its people fascinate me. Their history and culture seem almost chiseled on their faces. Most have not known a life without war. For centuries, this land has been ruled by nomadic tribes. With few exceptions, there was no central government. Afghanistan has long been the target of conquests, from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan, the British, the Soviets. And for the last 10 years, the Americans have been here, unleashed to oust the Taliban. That Taliban government is long gone, but its supporters remain.
Tell them all to shut up, chunks, and face the wall.
And that's why, a decade after September 11th, Afghanistan remains a dangerous place, especially if you travel with the U.S. military.
We got our route, we got comms. In case of any small arms fire, we push on our halfway point.
This reporter was invited to Camp Edgars, a NATO training base in Kabul.
You'll come in and you'll go up to the right on that road.
Before you can traverse the city, you have to plan for the worst case.
Our halfway point will be Kaya. Anything happens before that, we come back. Anything happens after that, we push on.
Here, our escorts are mapping what we hope will be a simple trip across town. But nothing is simple in Afghanistan.
The word of the week. Word of the week.
Fragment.
Fragment.
F-R-A-G-M-E-N-T.
You
Fragment.
got to take refuge in any other camp. They'll ask you for that.
These soldiers are constantly preparing for an enemy they seldom see, but they know is out there.
Let's roll.
Right. Thanks. We ride in armor-plated SUVs, specially outfitted with jamming equipment to prevent roadside bombs from being detonated via cell phone. But the bombings go on.
Did I understand him to say that if we run into trouble before the halfway mark, if it's real trouble, we turn around and come back. If it's after the halfway mark, we press on to the objective?
That's correct, sir.
In July, there were more than 1,600 IED strikes in Afghanistan. 1,600 in 1 month. That's the largest number ever in the Afghan war. And that's just one of the contradictions that is Afghanistan today. While some may try to hold on to the past, Kabul is moving on, quickly. The first thing I noticed was the vastly increased number of automobiles on the road. So many more than when I came here in the days after 9/11. You also can't help but notice the construction, new apartment buildings rising all over the city. So much of Kabul's infrastructure was destroyed by decades of conflict that there's now a serious housing shortage, and the population of Kabul is booming, from around 500,000 in 2001 to over 4 million people today, or as large as Los Angeles. Afghans are seeking economic opportunity and the safety of the city. In all my visits to Afghanistan, I've had very few conversations with women. Men, particularly foreign men, are expected to keep a distance. Under the Taliban, all women were forced to quit their jobs. Girls' schools were closed, and a woman who showed her face in public could be beaten. Which is why what I saw on this trip was so remarkable. Confident, quietly ambitious young women being welcomed into the new Afghan military. Second Lieutenant Mariam Yosefi made history last year when she graduated from the Afghan Army's first officer candidate school for women. Yosefi was one of 29 females to learn combat life-saving, drilling, and marksmanship. Today, with the help of British Army Captain Tony Berry, she's training another class of females.
She's starting to get a little bit more confident now. You can hear it in her voice. She's getting louder, which is good.
These 14 officers are going to jobs in communications and human resources. Not exactly frontline assignments, but still a remarkable step forward.
فقط میتونه با اردوی ملی یا به دیگه وظایف باشن. میتونه زنها هم با اردوی ملی و با کار دیگه هم اشتراک کنن.
19-year-old Safia Farouzi didn't want a desk job. She went through officer candidate school and set her sights on flying.
تحصیلات من ختم کنم در آینده یک پیلوت خوب باشم، یک پیلوت موفق باشم در افغانستان خدمت. نمیتونه زنها کاری نمیتونه، زنها نمیتونه که پیلوت باشه، زنها نمیتونه که در عرصه کار کنه. ما در آینده میخوایم که ما یک پیلوت موفق باشم که نشان بدم که آیا زنم میتونه کار یا نمیتونه.
Farouzi has passed her medical screenings and, believe it or not, at 5'2", she is tall enough to fly this hulking old Russian helicopter. Farouzi is excelling in her flight indoctrination and aviation classes, the only woman in a classroom of men. In Afghanistan, by tradition, most women in Afghanistan could not work at all, much less fly airplanes. What does this mean to you, and what does it mean to your country and its culture?
اجازه خو انمیال مامانده های زیاد است. ما از هر طرف هر گپ میشنویم میگه که دخترها را غرض نیست که در اردوی ملی باشه یا در میدان هوایی باشه، باعث پیلوت باشه. خب بخی اجازه نیست. بازم فامیل ما که راضی باشه دیگه بخشی دیگه را نیست.
English is the international language of aviation, and before she can fly, Farouzi has to improve her proficiency. To do that, she's living at the Thunder Lab, a new English immersion program where Afghan officers live with American and British instructors, working out, getting flight instruction, and speaking English 24/7. Lieutenant Colonel Daryl Sassaman runs the lab. Were you surprised when they said to you were going to train some women?
Not actually, because it was a commitment of their parliament, the commitment of their government to say that women would be brought into the armed forces.
They have hundreds of years of not allowing women to do very much.
And they are trying to break those cultural barriers as we speak.
8, 9, 10.
But breaking cultural barriers is easier said than done. I spoke to the handful of women who were living at the Thunder Lab, hoping to find careers in the new Air Force, and a woman named Fatima acknowledged that this could all just be lip service paid to the Americans writing the big checks. Let us say that you become a pilot, that you make it. And you look, we're hoping, right?
Yeah.
But become a pilot, and you get trained, and you come back. The Americans are gone, the NATO forces are gone, and the men in the military say, they're gone, you're not flying aircraft. Do you think that could happen?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Plenty of people in Afghanistan are not ready to see women in the workplace, much less in camouflage. Farouzi says she changes out of her uniform every time she leaves the base. Feruzi may be a sign of a new Afghanistan, or she and the Afghan military more generally may be more of a mirage that can't exist without a continued American and NATO presence. But with U.S. troops and our allies looking for an exit strategy, the bet we've made on building an Afghan security force remains our best chance at success. Meanwhile, U.S. and coalition troops continue to pay the ultimate price. More than 1,600 Americans and more than 900 of their allies have died in Afghanistan. It should be noted that this report comes to you as we're approaching the 10th anniversary of the start of the Afghan War, the longest war in American history. And that's our report for tonight. For HDNet, from Kabul, Afghanistan, Dan Rather reporting. Good night. If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net.